All right, then continuing on, we're now in part 5 on Freemasonry, a Luciferian beacon. If you want to follow along, you can go to creationliberty.com, go to the search bar, type in the word Mason, M-A-S-O-N, and you'll find that article, Freemasonry, a Luciferian beacon. Or if you're listening by YouTube, you should be able to click the link in the description. It'll take you roughly to where we are. If you do go look up that website, the section you'll want to click on, because there's a content section at the top of the page, and it'll have all the different chapters that are in the article. And the one you want to click on is called Mystery Symbols, because that's where we're at now, because we just got done talking about all the oaths that they take, and now we're going to go look at some of these symbols. What do they mean? Because Freemasonry, and one of the most common symbols you'll see is the compass and square G with the G in the middle. We're going to find out today what that actually means. And many people think they know, and I'm telling you, likely you don't. Okay, if you think you know what it means, unless you've studied this very thoroughly, like, okay, you've gone down and studied what Albert Pike and Albert Mackey say about the issue, then you probably don't know what it means. And I'm going to tell you this too, most Masons don't know what it means either. That's right, most Masons don't know what it means, and I'll show you what I mean by that in just a little bit. But one of the articles I would highly recommend Christians go and take a look at, even before, if you're listening to this and you've never checked out the teaching we have called Christian Symbols Are Not Christian, I would highly suggest stopping this teaching and going and checking that one out. Because it's going to explain, and in this article I put an image that I made for that other teaching. And the way you can find it, if you don't know how, and I don't know whether I'll remember to put a link in the description on YouTube or not. I may not even remember to do that. But if I don't, then you go to creationliberty.com, you go to the search bar, type in the word symbol, S-Y-M-B-O-L, and you'll find that article called Christian Symbols Are Not Christian. So things like the so-called Jesus fish and the cross symbols and all that stuff, none of those are of Christ. None of those represent Christianity, none of them at all. Okay? Acts 17:29 says, "For as much then as we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the Godhead is like unto gold, silver, or stone, graven by art and man's device." Those are images that are graven by art and man's device. We are not to think those are representative of the Godhead. And yet people do it all the time. Okay? Now I have, it's common for people to make symbols on things. That's why I have, like, sometimes you'll see the symbol, like if you're looking at our website or something, I have a little symbol that'll appear on a lot of the browsers at the top. It's just like a little Brachiosaurus dinosaur. And the reason I did that is because that's the first thing I ever wrote about when I started our ministry. I mean, a lot of people say, well, couldn't you put a Bible there or something? Yeah, but it's very difficult to get a symbol that small to represent a Bible. It just look like a book, and then I don't know. It doesn't really matter. For the most part, it doesn't really matter, okay? It's just one of the first things I started writing about. That's because I was really interested, and I liked the dinosaur topic, and to know that the Bible taught that dinosaurs and man had always lived together is really interesting to me. And that's one of the first things I wrote about. So that's why I have a T-Rex on the top of our website, and I have a little Brachiosaurus on the little symbol there. But you know, if people are offended by that, I'm sorry if you're offended by that, but that's what I used. But a lot of people do. It's common to do the little icon and symbol stuff today, mostly because of the internet and the way it works. But to say that, I'm not saying that the dinosaur, like the T-Rex or the Brachiosaurus I use on those, is representative of God. I never do that. I'm saying that that's one of the first things we did in our ministry, and we taught on creation subjects, so it's there. But I've never said that's representative of God in any sense. And you'll notice that unless I'm exposing it, and now this is as far as I know, maybe I've got something somewhere that I'm not aware of, and you'll have to forgive me if I do, but there's nowhere on our website you'll see any cross images unless I'm exposing them. Some of you may not even realize that. You'll never see that stuff on our website unless I'm exposing it. Okay? Because what you'll do is you'll take things like the so-called Jesus fish, which I'll explain to you, because well, maybe I should mention it now. That's actually what's called a Viseca Pisces. What does that mean? Well, that means you need to go check out the article and do that, because I did a whole teaching over that subject. I've got audio teaching and the article. You can look at all the stuff for it. But it's a Vesica Pisces that was taken from pagan witchcraft, and it's actually a symbol of the vagina, the feminine member, okay? That's what that actually is. But they say it's a fish that represents Jesus. That's not where that's taken from, okay? And so the typical ignorant churchgoer, what they do is they come along and they see that Jesus fish and they say, I see this as a symbol of Jesus and Christianity. And then the pagan witch comes along and sees it and says, oh, look at this. This is the pagan origin of Christianity. And they both have no idea what they're talking about. Neither of them. Again, Proverbs 12:15 says, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes. The way of the fool is right. Well, I'm going to see things the way I want to see it. That's a fool, the Bible says. You're foolish of heart. And you need to repent and study to show thyself approved unto God. All right? But likewise, Freemasonry has a lot of confusing symbols and hidden meanings. Just like the cross symbol is a confusing symbol that has hidden meanings behind it. Okay, and it's not Jesus Christ. As I've already proven with Acts 17:29 proves that conclusively. It's not of Christ. And yet it's used all the time. But I want to start off talking about Freemason symbols by looking at this compass and square G. And it's going to look almost like an A, and if you've seen it before, I mean, I'm not going to sit here and describe it too much, because most of you have seen it before, one place or another. If you don't know exactly what it looks like, or you're listening to this, you don't know, again, go to the website. All the pictures are on there. We've got all the images, all the references to all the information I'm going to be giving you is on there. You can go look this up for yourself. So one of the stickers I have on here on the website is showing the compass and square with the G in the middle, and it says on the outside, making good men better, faith, hope, charity. Or another one that says, proud to be a Freemason. Even though pride in the Bible is evil, and that pride goeth before destruction, and people saying, oh, I'm proud of this, and proud of that, and proud of these things, and proud of my children, and proud of the school, and proud of... Ugh. Folks, you need to research what the Bible says about the proud and pride. It's not good. Okay? So, now, when I say most Masons don't know what this means, it's because low-level Masons are led to believe they know what these mean, because they're given a false explanation during their initiation. Now, if you remember in part 1 or 2, I covered that point, where the heads of Freemasonry that I keep quoting from, like Albert Mackey, Albert Pike, Manly P. Hall, people like that, which are the respected authorities of Freemasonry for all that it teaches and all that it believes in, they're the ones that everybody goes back to for that stuff. Now, they have stated that deception is what they give to initiate members. Like most people that are Freemasons are in the Blue Lodge. That's the first 3 degrees that we talked about last week, okay? First, second, third degree. And in the first, second, third degree, they are given a meaning of this symbol, but they have no idea what it means. They are led to believe they know what it means. And then the reason for that is because if someone like me or someone like one of you goes and tells a Freemason what that actually means, they're going to roll their eyes. They're going to say, no, you don't know because you're not a Mason. I'm in the Masons. I know. No, they don't. They're being lied to. Because until they get to the higher degrees, they're not going to be told what that symbol actually means. Or any of the symbols, really. They'll not be told what any of them actually mean until they get to the higher levels. Because they think they're not worthy enough to handle that type of information. And we're going to find out today the true meaning of it. So they think that this meaning is based on the Bible, because that's what they're taught, right? I'm sure they're taught something else in like for example, the Hindu, in India, the Hindu Masonic temples, they're taught something else. I'm sure. I haven't really looked into that. But in American churchianity, they're taught that this compass and G symbol is actually based on the Bible. That's what they tell them. And here's a 20th century Masonic textbook called the Revised Freemasonry Illustrated. And they said, quote, "The Holy Bible is given to us as the rule and guide of our faith, the square to square our actions, and the compasses to circumscribe our desires and passions, and keep us within due bounds with all mankind, but more especially with the brother Mason." End quote. Now this quote, there's a few things we need to address in this quote, okay? Because first of all, did you notice in all that quotation, it never specifically states how you are supposed to square your actions? What actions exactly need to be squared? In fact, what does squaring them actually mean? It doesn't say that. It doesn't tell you anywhere how to square them, nor what actions should be squared. This is all very vague. They kind of let you take what meaning you want to take out of it, and that's what vagueness does. See, that's why a lot of church buildings, a lot of preachers are actually quite vague. When they preach, they do the same vagueness, because if they stay vague, especially the New Age televangelists, they're probably the most guilty of doing that. Because the more vague they are, the more people will accept their message. Another good example is the New Age churchianity, like church building type Christian rock, so-called. They call it Christian rock music. It's not Christian at all. Or the CCM or things like that. People like Amy Grant, people like the Michael W. Smith. Neither of them are Christians. If you want to know more about that, you can type in Grant, Grant, into the search bar, creationliberty.com. You can find an article called Wolves in Costume, Amy Grant. Or if you want to do Michael W. Smith, you just type in Smith, S-M-I-T-H. You should find an article called Wolves in Costume, Michael W. Smith, and that'll expose all that. It'll show you all the details of that. These people are not Christians in any sense. But what they do is when they sing, and when they sing their music, they write their songs are incredibly vague. They're not very specific. You'll notice that the older hymns are extremely specific. Unto the blood of the Lord Jesus Christ and His saving grace and all, and for that He saved us from our sin and things like that. Okay, all that stuff they're very specific. But if you look at these New Age songs that are coming out, they're incredibly vague. And that's why they're so well accepted. There are many Michael W. Smith songs. He has traveled all over the world, even into, I've looked at him where he's gone into places like India, to a Hindu nation, which a lot of his audience was not Christian, and they loved his music. Why? It's not that they didn't understand it. They did, but they could accept it because it was so vague. Because when you talk about God, to them, oh, well, you must be talking about Vishnu or Krishna. That's what they think. So the more vague you are, the more people will accept it, which is exactly what they've done here with these definitions of squaring our actions. What exactly is that supposed to mean? And so what happens is that Masonry, again, as we've already covered, it's trying to have people adapt to whatever religion connects to it. So whatever God you worship, as long as you believe in some sort of God, they're okay with that. Doesn't have to be the Christian God of the Bible. Just believe in some God or some higher power that you can mold your views. Let me restate that. They want to mold your views of whatever God you claim to believe in. They want to try to mold that into the vision of Lucifer. Now, atheists are, again, they're the only people that are not allowed to join the Freemasons, as far as I know. There's a separate secret society for them, for atheists. That's called humanism. And humanism has similar goals, but I'll have to do another teaching on that. Maybe someday in the future I will do a teaching on humanism and the deception of that. But depending on the history and the background of the well, I guess maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here. I wanted to also mention this because I'm going to quote Albert Mackey here in a moment, but it also talks about that the compass, because a square is something to make lines perfect, right? Or you're going to make perfect angles or whatever that when you're drawing something. But a compass, when you draw it, it's making perfect circles, okay? And so what they're trying to say in here is like, oh, well, the circle of the compass is talking about a circle to give us boundaries. And like he said, to keep us within due bounds with all mankind. What exactly does that mean? And if that's supposed to be good, it also says, but more especially with the brother Mason. Don't worry about all mankind as much as you worry about the Masons. Well, that's interesting, because it still doesn't tell us what exactly that's supposed to mean. But it does claim that that compass in G is from what they call the Holy Bible, the rule and guide of our faith. See, they're deceiving people. So, anyway, they start out by giving this fluffy, sugar-coated lie that's going to appease the initial Masons, because they have got to condition them to a certain point before they can accept what it really means. So the compass is what's called, according to the Masons, a point within a circle. Okay, the point within a circle, that's what they're calling the compass part of this. And that's how compasses make perfect circles, because if you've ever used one like in school or something, it has the pencil attached to one side, and then you've got the sharp pointy end on the other, and you stick the sharp pointy end in the ground and or on the paper, then you lean the pencil side down and you simply turn it in a circle, and it makes a perfect concentric circles for you. And remember that witchcraft, paganism, they're all about symmetry. That's what the whole thing's got to be about. This is from Albert Mackey in his book Manual of the Lodge. He said, quote, "The point within a circle is an interesting and important symbol in Freemasonry, but it has been so debased in the interpretation of it given in the modern lectures that the sooner that interpretation is forgotten by the Masonic student, the better it will be." So you see what he's saying here? That interpretation, the initial interpretation that, oh, this is of the Holy Bible to square our actions, what he's saying here, he says that initial interpretation that's given to new initiates, he says the better they forget that, the better it's going to be. Because he's saying that's not what it means. He continues to say, the symbol is really a beautiful but somewhat abstruse allusion to the old sun worship, and introduces us for the first time to that modification of it known among the ancients as the worship of the phallus. The phallus? What does he mean by that? Well, the next sentence he says, the phallus was the imitation of the male generative organ, the penis. It's a phallic symbol. That's what the compass stands for. It was represented usually by a column, which was surrounded by a circle at its base, intended for the Citiaia, which I believe that's what I've researched, that's how that's pronounced. It's Cteis, or Citiaia. What's the Citiaia? The female generative organ, the vagina. That's what the square means. This union of the phallus and the Citiaia is well represented by the point within the circle, was intended by the ancients as a type of the prolific powers of nature which they worshipped under the united form of the active or male principle or the passive or female principle, end quote. So to make sure you understand why are they using a compass and square as the symbols for that? Well, you see, he's talking about the active or passive. See, the passive vaginal symbol, that's the square, because the square you put there and it's passive and you draw around it. But the compass is what you put in and you draw with it. It actually moves, so it's the active one. The whole thing is about pagan sex between gods and goddesses. That's what that symbol really means. And the G It does not represent God. It does not represent geometry. That's what they'll tell you. Remember what Albert Mackey just said. He says the phallus was the imitation of the male generative organ. It means generative or generation, meaning that's what the G is for. It's the representation of the phallic symbol, the male generative organ. I told you last week, once you find out what this means, it's going to make you sick every time you see it. It'll make you sick to your stomach. Now again, when he writes about the interpretation given in what he says, quote, modern lectures, end quote, what he's saying is that the modern lectures are the ones that are given to either the public, like if you tell anybody else who's not a Mason, or anybody that's in the first, second, or third degrees and never goes any higher. Which, by the way, women can't. Women can't go higher than that. So women are only told, oh, this is a symbol about God, and then they believe it. They believe the fanciful lie and just go off into their blissful ignorance. And the low-level initiates just repeat the lie they were told, thinking that they know the truth. But they're clueless, willingly so. I would say they're willfully ignorant. Because they could do this research the same as I've done it. But they choose not to. Then he says it's better for that interpretation. Now when he says that interpretation, that means that lie, because that's the honest truth right there. He says it's better for that lie to be, quote, forgotten by the Masonic student, end quote. And he also includes that it should be done as soon as possible. He says the sooner they forget it, the better off it's going to be. Because they're trying to get more initiates to climb the ladder into Luciferian ideology. The initiate Blue Lodge, they're only there to try to get indoctrinated to a point that they will join the Luciferian cult. Because again, I don't know whether I covered this earlier or whether I quoted it later. I think we already did cover it, because I can't remember exactly where in the teaching that I did this, or I wrote this down, but the quote where they said, look, the people in the Blue Lodge, we may have covered that last week. I think we did. Maybe it was at the end of last week, where he says the people in the Blue Lodge, they're not necessarily Masons yet. Was that up there? I'm pretty sure it was. Yeah, I think that was Albert Pike in Morals and Dogma. He's the one that said that. He says those blue degrees, they're not technically Masons yet, because they haven't gotten the knowledge they need in order to become full-fledged Luciferians. So, Mackey is going to explain some more details. Before I get into the more details that he explains about this, I want to explain I just want to recap two main points here, okay? Number one, Mackey explains that the faith, hope, and charity in the Bible and bettering yourself with moral principles, which are common interpretations that people claim are connected to this symbol, is a complete lie. Number two, the Freemason symbols you see on bumper stickers or etched into the side of buildings is a pagan symbol of witchcraft that worships the sexual intercourse between the sun and the moon, the god and the goddess. Now, I give an example on the website here. This one it's a badge from the Grand Lodge of Ohio from 2008. Okay? And it was talking about how I believe their lodge had existed from 1808 to 2008 at that point, that it was like a 200-year anniversary badge that they put for the Grand Lodge of Ohio. And you can see that that's why this circular symbol is used. The outside of the circle represents that compass, and technically what that's representing, the outer circle would be the vagina, and the inner point in the middle is the sexual union between the god and the goddess. That's why it's all symmetrical like that. And the G, again, represents the generative male and female sex organs. That's where that comes from. And this is a secret only adept members of Freemasonry learn, that it's a symbol of pagan worship and witchcraft. Now let's move on to what Albert Mackey goes further to say in his book, An Encyclopedia of Freemasonry and Its Kindred Sciences, Volume 2, if you look under the definition of phallic worship. Now this is kind of long, but I want to explain this because it's going to help us understand why. Why do they have this sex symbol there? Well, this is going to correlate to things that we've already gone over. It says, quote, "The phallus was a sculptured representation of the membrum virili, or male organ, of generation, and the worship of it said to have originated in Egypt." Now remember, we've already talked about that. A lot of the traditions they took from the Egyptians, which came from the Babylonians, which is Mystery Babylon, or what they call the Mysteries. Same exact thing. That's why I covered those points. I know those points in the first couple teachings were a little dry, but that's why we covered those first, is because we're going to see this repeated. So that way you can see the pattern and know what the origin of this stuff is. Because once you understand the origin of this Egyptian cultic witchcraft junk and the Babylonian junk, then you're going to understand what Mystery Babylon is. Then you're going to understand how to avoid other things that are like this. Because we're going to see more stuff like this pop up in teachings in the future on different topics. And you can see the connection between them. He continues to say, "The symbol of the male generative principle was very universally venerated among the ancients, and that too as a religious rite. In the mysteries it was carried in solemn procession. The Jews, in their numerous deflections into idolatry, fell readily into that of this symbol." And he's right. Because the Jews did repeatedly fall into idolatry, and they used these same type of symbols that the Freemasons were using, because the witches used them, because that's where it came from. It came from the pagans and the witches, the Chaldeans, which we already confirmed, that's the Chaldeans were supposed to be the original people of their order, where all the Freemasonry, they claim, there's no historical evidence for it, but they claim they were descendant from the Chaldeans. He continues to say, "But the phallus, or as it was called among the Orientalists, the lingam, was a representation of the male principle only. To perfect the circle of generation, it is necessary to advance one step farther. Accordingly, we find in the Siddhaya of the Greeks and the Yoni of the Indians the symbol of the female generative principle of the coextensive prevalence with the phallus." And what he means by all that, I know that was weird the way he phrased all that. Basically, it means this is sexual intercourse. He says, what we need to perfect all this is to bring about the sexual intercourse symbols. So he continues to say the Siddhaya was a circular and concave pedestal or receptacle on which the phallus or column rested, and from the center of which it sprang. So saying that the Siddhaya, the vaginal symbol, it was the pedestal on which the phallus would stand, that's going to be important, because I'll show you a very famous example of that all of you will have heard of. I'll show you that in just a moment. But the union of these two, as he continues to say, as the generative and the producing principles of nature in one compound figure, was the most usual mode of representation. So what he's saying is that normally you wouldn't have the phallic and the vaginal symbol individual of one another. He says sometimes you'd find it, but not most of the time you find them connected in one compound symbol. And he continues to say, and here I think we undoubtedly find the remote origin of the point within a circle, an ancient symbol which was first adopted by the old sun worshippers and then by the ancient astronomers as a symbol of the sun surrounded by the earth or the universe, which, by the way, is another pagan representation as well of all that. He continues to say, the sun as the generator and the earth as the producer. Okay, so the sun, that's why the sun is always represented as the male figure, the male god, the phallic symbol. Okay? He continues and says, and afterward modified in its signification and incorporated into the symbolism of Freemasonry, end quote. So he says he's saying directly, they took it from the pagans and the witches, they took it from them, from Egyptian lore and Babylonian lore and all those things, and then incorporated it into their Freemason symbols. Now, I do want to on the side mention, I had heard somebody say this one time, who used to be a Freemason. I was unable to find the proper documentation for this, but he was a high-level Freemason. I believe he was 33rd degree or something, 32nd or 33rd degree. He was pretty high up. But he explained that, if you guys remember when we talked about Jack the Ripper, we were talking about how all the Masons were given a white leather or lambskin apron. That was the symbol. They said it was the badge of a Freemason. That's what it was said to be, okay? And I gave those quotations, I think it was, what was it, last week when I went over that? So what you need to understand, and like I said, I wasn't able to document this, but I heard this was the case, was, if you remember in the Bible how the Ark of the Covenant was taken into the temple of God, right? And it was covered by a thick curtain. So there was a covering for it. So what it was is that their Holy of Holies, which was the Ark of the Covenant, was given a covering. And Freemasonry also has what they call a Holy of Holies, and they have a covering for that too, and that's the apron. Because it's covering their Holy of Holies because they worship the phallic symbol. It's pretty disgusting, isn't it? I wasn't able to document that. I'll just tell you about it. I don't know if that's the case or not, but from everything I have read about Freemasons, that makes perfect sense. Perfect sense to what I've seen them do. So don't think, I mean, you always think, wow, the Masons seem to do all these weird things. Maybe they're just old stuff. No, it is old. It is ancient. But it's not just weird. It's witchcraft. And it's worship of sexual generative organs. So you got to understand that fornication and adultery is going to be at the forefront of this Luciferian cult. And from the stories I've heard, it is. Now, I've had some low-level Masons try to condemn me for pointing this out, of what this symbol actually means. I don't really care if they get all disgruntled by it. These are the facts. The reason they're irritated is because they realize if what I'm saying was true, and if what Mackey said was true, and it is, then they've been duped. They've been deceived. And they don't want to think they would be deceived by this stuff, so they would rather blame me or say, you don't know what you're talking about, and simply do what a lot of people do, and I've had so many people do this. They'll write me and say, I read your article on this and I don't like it. And then they'll make an argument that I answered in the article, which shows me they didn't read the article. There's a number of them I've caught on it who've been honest with enough to tell me. I said, you skimmed it, didn't you? You didn't actually read it. They said, well, yeah. So I said, so you lied to me when you said you read it. What you did is you skimmed it, because you read the title and didn't like it, and you just wanted to fight. You just wanted to cause contention over your personal feelings and opinions. So what they'll do is that they'll skim over something. They won't actually read it. They won't take a look at it and say, I've seen nothing here to disprove Freemasonry. I've seen nothing here that says Freemasonry isn't of the Bible, when they wouldn't even look at it. I mean, I've seen that stuff. I've seen so many people do that in so many different settings. They won't even look at something and say, I haven't seen anything. I've seen it with Jehovah's Witnesses. I've seen it with evolutionists. I've watched them do it too. Like I remember the Paluxy River, when the tracks were first uncovered, showing dinosaur and footprints of mankind together in the same rock layer, and say, look at this. I've heard the stories where even Nova went down to film and brought an evolutionary scientist with him, and he refused to even look down at the tracks. He kept his nose up in the air the whole time, and he says, I've seen nothing here to disprove evolution. That way he could lie. They had to not look at it so they could justify themselves to lie to people. I mean, technically they say, well, if I don't look at it, then I'm not lying, because I haven't seen anything. They're still liars and they're deceivers. And that's what they'll do with these kind of teachings too. They'll just run past them. They won't care. They won't bother to even look and check it out. Mackey said the point within a circle is solely based on the sexual union of the sun god and the moon goddess of paganism, and that squares perfectly with everything that witches teach. and low-level initiates are lied to on purpose to keep them in the dark. Mackey goes deeper into the subject by showing other pagan symbols that use the same thing. Okay, and I'm going to show you one of them on here. It's on the website here. I'm having a hard time describing this one, okay? It's got like the world at the bottom with wings on it, and then it's got squares and triangles that are perfectly symmetrical on there, and it has a dragon laying on top of that, and on top of the dragon is standing this person that has two heads. One is a male, one is a female. On the female side, you have the square. On the male side, you have the compass. On the female side, you have the moon. On the male side, you have the sun. Those of you who have listened to our teachings and followed them through over the years, you should say, this makes perfect sense to everything else we've ever studied. Yeah, through the Christmas witchcraft traditions, the Easter witchcraft traditions, and everything we've covered that has to do with witchcraft, whether it was video games or movies or whatever else it was, lines up perfectly with this right here. And most of you can see it now. From Albert Mackey in his Encyclopedia of Freemasonry and its Kindred Sciences said, quote, "This plate, which is hermetic in its design but is full of Masonic symbolism, represents a winged globe inscribed with a triangle within a square." And by the way, this symbol I'm talking about, this plate, is from the 17th century. So this is from the 1600s. And the Hermetic philosophers were an ancient occultic tradition involving alchemy and astrology. Okay? And so it says a winged globe inscribed with a triangle within a square, and on it reposes a dragon. On the latter stands a human figure of 2 hands and 2 heads, surrounded by the sun and the moon, and 5 stars representing the 7 planets. If you don't know what that means, it actually doesn't matter. The fact is, it's got the sun and the moon there, right? That's what we're focusing on right now. One of the heads is that of a male, the other of a female. The hand attached to the male part of the figure holds a compass, that to the female a square. So you see how it's representing the male and female organs there again. The square and compass thus distributed seem to me to indicate that originally a phallic meaning was attached to these symbols, as there was to the point within a circle, which in this plate also appears in the center of the globe, end quote. And he's right, it does. You can see the point they purposely put in there if you look at the image. And again, this type of sexual worship of the sun god and moon goddess, it's not uncommon. And people say, oh, well, the compass and G, well, that's just something unique that they do, so I'll just stay away from that. But a lot of people don't realize that these church buildings and churchgoers, they use that sexual sun god and moon goddess worship. They use it all the time. I'll give you an example. The Christmas wreath. That's what the Christmas wreath means. It's the same exact thing that the compass and square G symbol means. The same exact meaning is applied. It's just in 2 different symbols. And yet they hang them all over their church buildings and all over their houses and put them everywhere. And they choose to remain willingly ignorant of it. I mean, I listened to a guy one time that said he had to leave a church over that issue right there. He told them what that meant, that he grew up around witchcraft. He told them what that meant, and they refused to take him down. Even on the basis that it might offend someone else, for them it was their, oh, well, that gives us the warm, gooey feeling inside. We can't ever do that. It doesn't matter what they mean to us. It doesn't matter even if we offend somebody else or offend our brethren. It doesn't matter about that, as long as we have our warm, gooey feelings inside and that we feel good about ourselves. They hang their pagan icons all over their church buildings. If you want to learn more about that and the truth about those Christmas symbols and what they actually mean, I would highly advise, if you're born again in Christ, you need to learn what this stuff is and sanctify yourself. Type in the word Christmas, Christmas, into the search bar at creationliberty.com, and that'll give you an article called Christmas, the Rejection of Jesus, where you can learn more about that. So the position of the Masonic temples, the way they're positioned, actually lines up with these symbols about the phallic sun god worship. Now, unless there's a geographic or architectural problem with where they're trying to put a Masonic temple, Freemason temples will always face east, representing the worship of the rising sun god. There's a town or city called Shelbyville, which is about 10-minute drive out from where we live. And in Shelbyville, they have a Masonic temple there, and that Masonic temple faces east. It's out on State Road 9. It's interesting. A lot of people go, if you've seen where these Masonic temples are, go look at it. Look at where east is, and look, they're going to be facing the east. Now, if you find one that doesn't, if you were to go in it, which I would not recommend, since it's a Luciferian temple, but if you were to go inside, they actually repositioned them. First, let me quote this. This is from a Freemason book called The Mysteries, Unveiling the Knowledge of the Subtle Energy in Ritual. And it says, quote, "A Masonic temple always faces east. The worshipful master represents the sunrise at the equinox," end quote. So you see how this is all centered around the worship of the sun. So if they can't face the lodge east, and it has to face like north to south, then they'll reconstruct the room to face east. And this is from the book called Freemason Symbols and Ceremonies for Dummies. And the guy who wrote the book is a 33rd degree Mason. He said, quote, "Lodge rooms are usually oriented east to west. Ancient temples were constructed this way to be aligned with the east to west path of the sun. Even if a Masonic building actually faces north and south, when you walk into the lodge room, you're symbolically facing the east," end quote. Now let's go to Ezekiel chapter 8, starting in verse 13. "He said unto me," that's to God talking to Ezekiel, "Turn thee yet again, and thou shalt see greater abominations that they do. Then he brought me to the door of the gate of the Lord's house, which was toward the north. And behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz." Now remember, Tammuz was the Semiramis and Nimrod Tammuz connection, which was Babylonian. Okay? The mother has sexual intercourse with her son, produces an heir, which is supposed to be the reincarnation of her son/husband that she slept with. It's all sickening, but this is where their pagan worship comes from. "Then said he unto me, Hast thou seen this, O son of man? Turn thee yet again, and thou shalt see greater abominations than these. And he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house, and behold, at the door of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men, with their backs toward the temple of the Lord, and their faces toward the east. And they worshipped the sun toward the east." God has said in his word, this is an abomination to him. In fact, as far as I understand, the temple of God was actually designed to face north to south, on purpose, so that they would not turn to the sun and worship it. So the worship of the sun at equinox is precisely what witches have always done. And that's one of the reasons, folks, by the way, that Easter is an abomination in the sight of God. And most churchgoers, they couldn't care less what pleases the Lord Jesus Christ, because they're too wrapped up in their happy, fun-time pagan traditions, and they refuse to sanctify themselves. But for born-again Christians, I highly recommend you go to our website, creationliberty.com, go to the search bar, type in the word Easter, E-A-S-T-E-R. You'll find an article called Easter, Christians Celebrating Abomination. And I put up big banners on the front of our website every year around these traditional times. I have one for Halloween right now, because it's the end of September. We're about to go into October. And I have the banner up for Halloween right now to get people onto that stuff, so that way they understand that these are wicked pagan traditions of witches, that they need to sanctify themselves from this stuff. The blessings of God come when we sanctify ourselves from wickedness. So, continuing here, Mackey provided more than enough evidence for all this, but I also wanted to make sure that we mentioned Albert Pike as well, to say this isn't just coming from one person. Okay, and this is from Albert Pike's Morals and Dogma. He said, quote, "In the Mysteries was also taught the division of the universal cause into an active and a passive cause, of which to Osiris and Isis, the heavens and the earth, were symbols, These two divinities, the active and passive principles of the universe, were commonly symbolized by the generative parts of man and woman. Okay, and by the way, Osiris and Isis, that's the Egyptian version of Semiramis Tammuz. Like Semiramis and Nimrod with Tammuz. Osiris and Isis is the same symbolism. Now you can see why they're so closely related. He continues to say, to which, in remote ages, no idea of indecency was attached. So what he's saying there when he says no idea of indecency was attached, he's talking about the generative parts of man and woman. So to get straightforward here, he's talking about the penis and vagina. He's saying there was no idea of indecency attached in remote ages, which would be technically true when we read about the Roman Saturnalia celebration, which, by the way, Christmas comes from Saturnalia, that same celebration, in which they would run around in nudity, having sex in the streets and things. That's the kind of stuff they did. Yeah, in those types of societies, there was no indecency attached to it. They should have been ashamed of themselves, but they got wrapped up in their lust and their sin and their devil possessions of all that they were doing, and there was no indecency attached because they did this stuff on a regular basis, so this was the kind of stuff they worshipped. So he continues to say, no idea of indecency was attached. The phallus and the cydia, emblems of generation and production, and which, as such, appeared in the mysteries. Again, the mysteries, like we talked about before, is still the representation of all their pagan witchcraft and sexual symbols that are coming from Babylon. That's the mysteries. He says, which were symbolized by what we now term Gemini, the twins, at that remote period when the sun was at that sign at the vernal equinox, and when they were male and female, and of which the phallus was perhaps taken from the generative organ of the bull, end quote. So the sexual symbols between pagan gods and goddesses, this is not uncommon throughout Masonic constructs. For example, the famous Washington Monument in Washington, D.C., and that's what I said I was going to give you a famous example. This was originally constructed by Freemasons. Now on the website, I have pictures of it to where you can see. I have an aerial view picture. That's what a lot of people don't see. When you're on the ground level looking at it, you don't see a lot of this stuff. But you have to understand, the Washington Monument is this big, huge pillar that comes out of the ground. It is a phallic symbol. Okay? And they designed it specifically like this. In fact, even if you look all the way up, because the Washington Monument stands, and then you've got that famous pond that they have that's running up and straight and all that, even when you're looking at that, that even looks like a penis and testicles phallic symbol running along there. But then the phallic symbol itself, which is Washington Monument, okay, that is also sitting atop of the Viseca Pisces, which I mentioned earlier, where they got the Jesus fish from. That's a vaginal symbol it's sitting right on top of. The Washington Monument is a giant monument to sex of the sun god that the Freemasons worship, which is a Luciferian cult. And people just, they travel here every day to look at the Washington Monument and take pictures with all this big sexual symbol that they don't even realize what it is. They sit in their ignorance over the issue. And that's where I'm trying to cure that ignorance if people will listen. But again, I've never been very popular as a teacher. Never. And I think that's the way it's mostly always going to be. The prophets of the Old Testament weren't popular either. Very few people listened to them. So when we're teaching truth and righteousness and rebuking sin, people don't want to listen. So again, if you want to learn more about those symbols, I still recommend going to our website, typing in SYMBOL, the word symbol, in there, and read that article, listen to the teaching, Christian symbols are not Christian, and understand what all that means, okay? And why there's a bunch of churchgoers that are doing the same wickedness, okay? Because a lot of that, the different symbols that we're using, even in the cross symbol, there's paganism and witchcraft that is involved in that cross symbol. And there are different sections of paganism and witchcraft that actually show that even itself is also a sexual symbol. But also stop and consider this for a moment. And this may be even something I probably ought to add into this teaching on the article itself, is that when you stop and think about it, look at how like the Washington Monument, and they make these giant pillars like this that actually there's no purpose in that. There's absolutely no purpose in that structure. It doesn't function as anything. It's just a sexual symbol. Now think about to the church buildings you've seen and those giant points they put way up, like they make these steeples or whatever you call them, but it's these giant pillars they make on the top of it. Some of them are 30, 40, 60 feet high with their cross symbol on the top of it. The whole thing's a sexual symbol. That big pointy thing they put on the top of their buildings, that doesn't serve any purpose. It doesn't do anything. Well, it's out there to call the people in to worship. Yeah, they're calling in all these false converts, they're opening up their doors to everyone, which is not what the church did. Not the early church, they didn't do that. That giant thing they have up there is a phallic. They're copying. They may not even intended that when they started, but your intentions. I mean, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, folks. Okay. Those big things they put up on there are phallic symbols, and it's going to make you sick now when you start seeing that stuff. I'll give you another one because we're running short on time here, but I'll give you another one that'll show you what I'm talking about. There's a common symbol called a 2-ball cane that's put, and you've probably seen them before because there's churchgoers that wear these symbols on shirts and jackets when they go into church buildings, and they think it's just for golf enthusiasts because it looks like a golf club, right? It's got the handle part on the bottom, and then it goes all the way up, and then it's got the club part on the end at the top. And then there's two what looks like golf balls on the middle. And I've got the symbol on the website here. It's actually 2-ball cane is a play on words that represents the Masonic password Tubal Cain. And Tubal Cain was from when we talked about that earlier, Genesis 4:22. Every artificer in brass and iron, where they claim he was like the first Mason. It's ridiculous. Again, they have no evidence for any of that, any of their lore. They just claim that stuff, okay? But it's a play on words of Tubal Cain, 2-ball cane. Though the interpretation of that symbol is if you turn it upside down, because if you turn it upside down, you now have the phallic symbol, the penis and testicles right there. That is the actual meaning of that supposedly golf club or golf enthusiast symbol. It's a Freemason symbol. And those Freemasons who are high enough level know exactly what that means. And so those kind of phallic symbols you're going to see in a lot of places all throughout Freemasonry. And yet you almost, I mean, it's like you just never even hear about it because, again, most Freemasons are low level and they don't even know what this stuff means. They're not told. They're told it means one thing when it actually means another because they're deceived on purpose. There's another one I'll give to you, is the Shriner's hat. Now, those of you who've ever seen the Shriners, you know what these Shriner's hats look like. It's a red hat, which is called a fez, okay? Now, first of all, I need to explain to you that the fez was named after a town in Morocco. In that town in Morocco, they originally designed and produced that type of hat. That town in Morocco was slaughtered by the Muslims in their so-called holy wars, and that is why the fezes are red in color, because it represents the blood of their victims. On the front of that fez is, if you've ever seen them before, you'll recognize it. It's got like a scimitar. It's a Middle Eastern sword, which that's what they use to execute infidels in the Middle East. They're so-called heretics. They execute them with that sword. And then you'll see that at the bottom, it has the head of what looks like a pharaoh, which is worship of the Egyptian god Osiris. And then it has the moon and star symbols, a moon and star symbol, because the head's in the middle around this crescent moon and a star in the middle, that's a representation of the Muslim flag with the moon and the star. And the reason the Muslim flag has the moon and the star is because their Allah was one of 360 pagan gods, because these 360 pagan gods were all represented in this cube, which they have in Mecca right now. There's this big black cube that they have out there that they go and worship around. You guys have seen this kind of thing before. That thing was the original building that contained all these different gods in it. And Muhammad went in, got rid of all the other ones, and he selected the moon god, and he says, this is the true God, because Allah just means God. So everybody that worshipped all their different gods, they all called their god Allah. But then he said, this moon god, this is the real Allah, and we're all going to worship him. So he selected one of the pagan gods, and that moon god is what they call Allah, and that's why their flag symbol has the symbol of the moon, the crescent moon with the star in it, and that's because their god is a moon god. And they won't let anybody go in to that little cube building that's holy and sacred. You're not allowed to go in there, but inside would be a statue of that moon god. That's what the fez actually represents. It's a Muslim thing. It's sickening when you actually understand what it means. If you guys want to learn more about that and all that Islam stuff I was talking about, you go to creationliberty.com, type in the word Islam, I-S-L-A-M, into the search bar. There's an article you'll find called Islam, Religion of Terror. Read through that. I have a lot of things we explain on there about those stuff, about what that stuff actually means and what they actually believe. I've documented all. I quote directly from their Quran. I show you exactly what they're teaching, and show you that the mainstream media of, Islam is a religion of peace, that is a load of garbage. It is a religion of absolute terror. And so you can get more information if you go there and check that stuff out. So that's where we're going to end for today. And next week we're going to pick up talking about the Order of the Eastern Star. There is a symbol of the Order of the Eastern Star, and we're going to find out where exactly that Order of the Eastern Star symbol comes from. As well, we'll take a look at one other symbol past that, but I'm only going to give you just a few of them, and then we're going to move from there. And once we're done with that, we're going to go into talking about the Masonic Messiah. Oh yeah, the Freemasons have a Messiah too. And we're going to go into talking about who that exactly is starting next week. Anybody have any questions or comments about anything we talked about today before we close? Well, thanks for joining us, everybody, this week, and may the Lord Jesus Christ bless and protect you all as you seek to study His Word and glorify Him in all that you say and do, and God willing, we will see you next week.